Hey, good afternoon, Austin Oaks Church. We kick off this is our last Beatitude. If you've been with us this whole time, this is the last Beatitude we'll cover, the final one, number 8. And then next week, we'll wrap it up with the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, which is incredibly important and pretty amazing as well. Probably not just the content of this message that Jesus gives is so influential and so important, but even the structure of it, it's really an incredible model of just a well-written, well-structured message with a quick intro, kind of an overview outline and all the Beatitudes, all of them explained, and then a really powerful and impactful conclusion that we're going to see next week. So hopefully you can be here with us then as well. Hey, good to have you all here this afternoon. Let me know you're here. People are starting to trickle in as we go. So we're going to look at Matthew 5 today. Verse 10 is the 8th Beatitude, the final one. And as we're going to see the most significant one, it's kind of the climax or the peak of Jesus' message in the Sermon on the Mount. And we'll see why that is. But the key to this is that the things we gain through our obedience to Christ are significantly greater than any losses that we might incur. And the fact is, we're going to incur losses. In fact, the more mature we are and the more committed we are to God and obedience to Him, the more loss we're going to experience in this world. But the less important that's going to become, because we're going to recognize that this isn't what we live for, gains here. So love to hear from you this afternoon. Comment. Let me know you're here and you're joining. I see people are trickling in, so we'll get started in a few minutes. I just want to say hi to a few people, so let me know you're here. And we will jump in. I also want to encourage you again that this week we'll have our home sites available. So if you aren't plugged into a home site yet and are able to and want to, we would really love to see you get connected to one of our home sites for Sunday services. I went to several of them last week. It was truly a blessing, both for worship and for the message, to have a little interaction afterwards, have a handful of people at each of those sites and just feel a little bit more connected than we often do if we're just worshiping in our own homes. So I know some people are still needing to do that, and that's great. That's always going to be available. But if you are ready, if you're able to jump out and meet with some other people, I think it can make a big difference. It's really sweet just to hear the voices of other people singing, to engage together around the message, just to have that, I guess, connection of being gathered together a little bit more. It's just a great sense of community. So hey, let me know you're here. I see you guys trickling in and waiting to see if some of the usuals are back with us as we jump in. So I'm not getting, there we go. Hi, Martha. Good to see you. So great to have you both here, the Boswells. You're in for a good one. Also, this is probably a very, hate to say it, a very anti-American message. It's going to go against a lot of principles that we tend to cling to and make idols as Americans, but it's going to challenge us a little bit here. So good to have you here. Let me know if you're here. I see several others are on watching, just waiting to hear from a couple, and then we're going to jump in. So let's go ahead and get started. As you're going to see here today, I'm going to come back to this little passage here. Let me hide this banner. So at the beginning of this study on the Sermon on the Mount, we saw this structure that's referred to as a chiasm. Don't worry about the name of it. It's just the Greek letter chi, which looks like our X. And this was a very common structure that Jewish teachers used in the days of Jesus. And before that, often several of the Old Testament books are structured in this way, or sections of it are structured in this way. And it was a simple form of outlining, different than how we outline today, but very effective for them since they didn't have the same resources to write with. And so what they would do is structured in the form of an X, meaning you see that the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H running down the top left side. Then what it does is it repeats itself going backwards, back out to A. And so this kind of structure allowed them to put the primary emphasis, or the most important point, right in the middle of the message. So at that turning point is what's most important. So if you were to look on here, let me jump over so you can kind of see a cursor. So if I put this cursor here, you can see up here, I'll draw a little line. Here's the A right here. That's where it would start, and that corresponds to verse 3 of chapter 5, the very first beatitude. And each letter at the beginning represents another beatitude, and that's how it was structured from A down to H. Then what happens is the whole rest of the sermon works its way back out backwards from H to G to F to E to D to C to B to A. So we've been studying them and connecting the first part of the outline, meaning the beatitude, to the second part of the sermon that Jesus gave that's explaining that particular beatitude. And today we're in this middle section right here. Okay, we're looking at the final beatitude, which is verse 10, and then it's explained immediately in verses 11 through 20. So the key to this chiasm is that when you get to the midpoint, when you know the structure and you see that midpoint, this is the most important part of the message. It's whatever the author is trying to communicate. This is the highlight of it. This is the main thrust. It's the one key climax that they're trying to get to when they teach on this topic. So today's message is critical. It's the heart and soul of what Jesus wanted to communicate within it. And you're going to see that that's very obvious as we get into it, when we understand what the key to Jesus' message was, why Jesus even came. So that's that part of it. So let's skip down through all these other ones that we've covered and get down to Beatitude number 8 right here. Let's read it a little bit together. It says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs." So let's talk about this a little bit. This is the climax of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. So it's the epitome of the gospel. This is all about the gospel and the heart of it. And it's saying that blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, or for the sake of righteousness, or God's righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. So one of the principles we see in this passage is a willingness to be persecuted for the sake of righteousness is the deepest form of maturity. These are all, as we saw earlier, each of the Beatitudes builds on one another, and they're simple stepping stones of maturity. Not that you finish one before you move to the other, but they need to kind of build in the order in which they are listed. Meaning to be poor in spirit, which is the very first one, is how you enter the kingdom of heaven. It's first recognizing your desperate need for God. You can't really develop any other aspect of true maturity in terms of these attitudes until you first recognize your need for God. So that's first and primary, is trusting Christ as your Savior, recognizing you are bankrupt, you have nothing, and He has everything. That's the start of it. And the end point, which is this last beatitude, is a willingness to be persecuted for the sake of righteousness. And that's the deepest form of maturity we can have. So if we come back here and read a little bit more, it says, "You are blessed when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say every kind of evil against you because of me. Be glad and rejoice, because your reward is great in heaven. For that is how they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So Jesus gives us a reason why we can be persecuted, and not just woe is me, which is very typical of us as Christians oftentimes, is we throw our little self-pity parties, and we all do this as part of our maturing process. But we can be so full of pity and sorrow, and oh my goodness, I've lost so much. Woe is me. Look what I have to give up in this world. The sad thing about that is that ultimately just reveals our love for this world and our longing to hang on and cling to the things that this world can offer and this present fallen, broken kingdom can offer, as opposed to what God offers. And we see in this passage that Jesus gives us a promise that far exceeds anything we could ever receive in this world. He says we should be glad and rejoice, not because we're gluttons for punishment. We should be glad and rejoice because our reward is great in heaven. When we do so, when we recognize that when we experience loss, not just because we're silly or we're stupid in our decisions or unwise, but when we experience loss because of being persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for doing the right thing, and for the gospel's sake, then we have a great reward in heaven. And that reward is going to last longer than any reward we could ever gain or lose here on this earth. And it's going to be infinitely greater in value than any reward we could acquire here. So that's a couple key parts of it. So next thing we're going to see on here is I need internal character and external impact to fulfill my purpose. So these are tensions that Jesus is going to teach us that are so important because in the church, we often swing to one extreme or the other. Many churches either run with one of these ideas or the other, but the truth is they need to be held in tension. Both of them are absolutely important and part of our growth and maturity. And Jesus uses this little illustration that many of us are familiar with, but often haven't taken the time to really evaluate what they mean. He says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. So he talks about salt here, that we are the salt of the earth, and salt loses its taste. That taste or the saltiness of something is based on its internal characteristics or its internal character. And salt in that time wasn't pure salt. It had other minerals mixed in with it that they would use. So if the saltiness aspect of it got leached out or removed from whatever the materials is and other minerals, then basically it was worthless. They just tossed it out. It couldn't accomplish what it was intended to accomplish in terms of preserving something or giving it some flavor. And so Jesus says the same thing about us as Christians, that we are the salt of the earth. And what he's essentially saying is twofold. One is that we should have an internal character about us that brings value, that brings preservation, that brings flavor, and is seasoning this fallen and broken world that we live in. Meaning because of who we now are internally, the internal character that we have as Christians should be a blessing, should be a preservative in the world in which we live. So he's talking in particular about our internal character, okay? It's so important that we recognize that our internal character is absolutely vital. So that means we have to grow in these attitudes that we're learning in the Beatitudes. We can't just live like the world lives and expect to have an impact in our world. The other tension that we have to live with, he says in the second part of this little statement, he says, you are the light of the world. So two things he's going to say about us as Christians. One is we're the salt of the earth, meaning our internal character, because of being followers of Christ, is a preservative and a seasoning. It's something that's a blessing to this world. But the second thing he says, you are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Okay, so the second characteristic we have is not being salt, it's being light. And light talks about our external positioning, in a sense. What he's talking about here is, he said, no one does what? No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. In the same way, meaning in what way? Don't take your light, meaning don't take your life and stick it under a basket or hide it in a little secluded place or isolate yourself from the world. Instead, you are to take your light and place it in a place where it can shine into a dark world. This is so important. These two truths are such a simple way in which Jesus addresses so many common issues within the church that are common. And churches and humans tend to slide to one of these examples or the other. And Jesus says, no, both of them are true. There's some groups and within Christianity that are all about being pure on the inside and their character and their purity. And so what they do to preserve their purity, they totally isolate themselves from the world. And they're all about being really salty. Oh, we want to have such perfect and preserved internal character, which is important. But in order to accomplish it, they completely isolate themselves from the world. They think, I have to totally separate from the world and everything out there. If I'm even near it or I even touch it, I become evil or I become bad. And that's just not true. Jesus changed that when he came, meaning that it's us that can have positive impact on the world when we bring our saltiness out to them. There's the other side of the camp too that can slide to the other extreme and saying, hey, I want to have so much impact in this world that I'm going to try to integrate and be just like the people in this world. I'm going to try to dress like them. I'm going to act like them. I'm going to hang out the places they hang out. I'm going to do the things that they do. And they're doing a great job with the second part in terms of being light in a dark place. The problem is they lose their saltiness in the midst of it because they forget that even though they're to be positioned in places of impact, they can't lose their saltiness, their internal character. They can't compromise who God's called them to be in order to have an impact. You're not going to be a light in a dark place if you do the same things that darkness does. So what we see here very beautifully is Jesus in a very simple metaphor that he uses to describe us, holds this tension that both of these must be true of Christians and both of these must be true of the church. We are called to have an internal character that is unique and salty in this world. And that means we have to live differently. However, we're called to be a people who are positioned out in the darkness. We must be amongst the darkness so that our light and our salt can actually impact others. I like how one pastor said it. He said there's three eyes. There's three different ways that Christians can often seek to live out in this world. And only one of them is correct, but three of them are common. One of them is we isolate ourselves from the world. And that's kind of this overemphasis on salty. We just isolate ourselves so that we can be the good little Christian that we want to be and not be influenced at all by the world. That's bad when we totally isolate. The other one is, the other extreme is we integrate ourselves with the world and we become just like them. We look like them, we act like them, we dress like them, behave like them, so that we think we can have an impact, but we lose our impact because we look just like them. So isolating is one extreme, integrating is the other extreme, and then the correct extreme is what we call insulate. It's like a cooler. You know what a cooler is designed to do? A cooler is not designed to put your beverages in and keep them cold while it's inside the refrigerator where it's already cold, right? In the safe place that they want to be. A cooler is designed to insulate your drinks so you can take cold drinks that are refreshing and beneficial and bring them out into a hot world and take them to a location that they normally couldn't be cold, but now they can because that insulation protects them from the impact of the world and allows a cold beverage to be a blessing to someone in a hot world. And that's the picture that we have as Christians. We should have this sort of like a cooler insulated around us that allows us to go into the world and bring the blessing, the saltiness, and the light that God's designed us to have without being integrated or becoming just like the world. And so that's so important. So let's talk really quick about this internal and external aspect, the internal character and the external impact. These are all really summed up in the Beatitudes. So the first four characteristics that we talked about in the Beatitudes, the first four Beatitudes, address our internal character. They are how we relate directly to God, deals with our internal character. Are we poor in spirit? Meaning, are we humble? That's the first step to walking with God, is being humble and recognizing we need him. And that's an internal character that we have to have. Next one was, do we mourn? Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And that's mourning sin, meaning, do we grieve over the sin in our lives and have a desire to see that changed and transformed? Again, that's an internal character. Do we have a meekness about us, which really means a God confidence, meaning, do we trust that God is our ultimate provider? And so it allows us to be meek when we interact with this world. We don't have to cling or pursue the things of this world or hang on to them in a way that makes us anxious or makes us greedy or makes us angry when we lose something that we think is so important. That's a meekness. It's an internal characteristic. And then a hunger for righteousness, meaning, do we want God's righteousness more than we want pats on the back by other people? Are we willing to pray in private? Are we willing to help others who are in need in private? Are we willing to do these internal things that connect us with God and grow us in his righteousness and develop our internal characteristic? That's the saltiness that Jesus wants us to have. And that's the first four Beatitudes and how we connect to God. The external ones are the second set of four. The first is merciful. Okay, these talk about how we relate to other people. So when we're humble and we recognize our own brokenness, we have a characteristic that allows us to be merciful towards other people, in particular towards unbelievers when they treat us wrongly or something happens. Just as God shows mercy to us, we are to show mercy to others. So that's an external characteristic. As we walk in this world and we act in mercy, we have an impact in this world. Are we pure in heart? That's speaking of our commitments. Do we mean what we say? Is our yes mean yes and our no mean no? That's, again, how we commit and how we relate to other people. And when they see us being pure in heart, being people of our word, and being willing to even suffer at times in order to fulfill a commitment that we've made, that has impact on the people in our world. Peacemakers. Do we make peace by addressing things, not becoming angry, not becoming vindictive, but going and making peace, even if at times it means great personal cost to ourselves? Do we put the peace of a relationship, that continued relational value? Do we value people more than we value things, so that we're willing to sacrifice things in order to maintain peace between people? And then the last one, as we see today, is being persecuted for righteousness, meaning when people do persecute us, treat us poorly, are we willing to not act in kind? Just as Peter told us about Jesus, that when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he was mistreated, he did not lash out. Instead, he offered forgiveness. He offered mercy. And when we do that, when we act that way in this world, it sends a message to people that's so different than what we typically see. So that's the external impact and internal impact. When I have internal character and internal and external impact, I'm going to face persecution. That's ultimately what Jesus is kind of alluding to in this, is that you're going to be persecuted because of righteousness, but know that the kingdom of heaven is yours. Meaning, when you're persecuted, all that's happening when you're persecuted is you're losing some kind of reward that this present world or this present kingdom offers. It might be the reward of your character, your reputation, not your character. Your character stays with you, but your reputation. Someone might slander you and it might hurt your reputation. It might hurt your feelings. Someone might persecute you by, taking something that you have, or harming your health, or harming someone else that's near and dear to you in this world. Someone that ultimately, on the big picture, we're going to lose at some point or another. Everyone is going to die. And I'm not meaning this to minimize these things. I'm saying that there are people in this world who have lost loved ones due to persecution. And that's deeply hard. It doesn't just, go away overnight. But with the proper perspective, we can recognize that God's promised to resurrect every one of his own children. And when he does that, he's going to give us brand new eternal bodies. We'll never have pain or suffering or any of those things again. And when we have that perspective that the kingdom of heaven is ours already, that it belongs to us, and that it's infinitely greater than anything we could ever receive or hang on to in this world, it totally changes how we respond to suffering and persecution. And I got to admit that growing up in America is maybe one of the greatest deterrents to this aspect of maturity that we could ever face or ever have. We often think our country is the greatest place to live. And I'm not saying it's not a great place to live. There's so many benefits to living in America. But you know what? One of them is not. It's not helpful in helping us learn to let go of the things of this world. Because in America, we are incredibly blessed with a lot of stuff that this world says is very important. And if there's one thing I've seen is living in some other cultures, and even being in some other cultures, is that people that have a lot less than we do don't expect all these things to be handed to them or given to them. They don't feel like they're rights here in this world. And that builds a sense and a willingness to sacrifice for others in a much greater way than it often does here in our country, where we have so much stuff that we come to expect a lot more than what God's really promised us in this world. So this is so important, that my internal character and my external impact is going to result in me being persecuted. When you want to truly have impact, and your character is such that it's set for that, your external position is such that you're going to want that, that's what's going to happen. But we're going to go on and see kind of where that goes, or where this leads us as we look at this last little section of the sermon here that Jesus gives. He says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." So Jesus didn't come to get rid of the law and the prophets. He came to fulfill what they said. That was his goal in being our Savior. And we're going to see that in here in just a minute. It says, "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all things are accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven." This is such an important section, and so often misunderstood. So first thing we want to see here is that Jesus fulfilled the law by living it perfectly. The law was intended for Israel and their covenant with God, and they failed to fulfill it and live by it for generation after generation after generation. And God sent his own son, Jesus, in human flesh to be a Jewish person, and he actually fulfilled the law perfectly. Every aspect of it, Jesus fulfilled. And then instead of being rewarded according to that covenant, he instead took the punishment that the covenant says must be inflicted on anyone who does not follow it. In a sense, every sacrifice, every animal sacrifice that they abided by in the law and the prophets was a form of forgiving or covering the sin or the broken aspect of the covenant that the Israelites failed to fulfill. And yet those things, those animals could never offer forgiveness. They could never cover their sin or stand in their place because it was an animal for a human. A human had to take the consequences for a human's action. And so those sacrifices simply pointed toward the true lamb or the true sacrifice that would one day come. And that was Jesus, who came and lived and fulfilled the law perfectly, and then offered himself as a perfect sacrifice for our behalf. He took the punishment that us breaking the law required and deserved, so that he could offer us the righteousness that his perfect life deserved. And so Jesus fulfilled that law perfectly by living perfectly. And what he's saying here at the very end, he says, hey, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never get into the kingdom of heaven. That would have been the most horrifying statement to the people of Jesus' day, because they thought that the righteousness of the Pharisees and the scribes was the highest level of righteousness you could have. I mean, it was the scribes and the Pharisees that actually heard from God during that time, or so they believed. They were the religious leaders. They knew the Old Testament. Many of them had the whole Old Testament, the first 5 books, memorized, committed to memory, and they were meticulous about following every letter of the law. And so in terms of righteousness, they seemed like the top of the heap. And Jesus is telling people, hey, your righteousness has got to surpass them if you even want to get into the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus' point was not that you had to be a better person than the Pharisees in terms of their outward obedience, because that was impossible. What he was telling them is that the true righteousness that you need is so superior to anything that you and I can accomplish through our religious works that there's only one way to get it. And that's to trust in someone who's perfectly fulfilled it for us and then offered himself as a sacrifice on our behalf. That's Jesus. That's the heart of the gospel. And you see that right in the very middle of this passage, is it leads us to a place of saying, there's absolutely no way I could get into the heaven or get eternal life or receive the kingdom of heaven on my own. And so only when we trust in Jesus and his perfect work will our righteousness be sufficient to enter the kingdom of heaven. Because the Bible says that when we trust in Jesus Christ, meaning we believe he is, who he said he is, that he's God's perfect son, that he lived a perfect sinless life and then died a horrific death as a sacrifice, as an offering of himself for our sins, that he took the punishment that we deserved so that we could receive the reward that he deserved. That's the heart of the gospel, church. That's what Christianity is all about. That's what sets it apart from every other major religion or any even philosophy in the world. Every other religion and philosophy is performance-based. It's based on your ability to perform and please God on what you bring to the table. And the fact is, we're all broken. None of us can measure up. But the gospel levels the playing field for everyone. So it doesn't matter what socioeconomic background you have, what your educational background is, what your race is, how good or bad a home you grew up in. None of those things matter when it comes to the gospel, because the gospel levels the playing field and says no one gets in until they humbly recognize that they are totally bankrupt and they receive this gift of eternal life through Jesus Christ. In fact, oftentimes, I think the irony of it is those people that have the most difficult circumstances in life more often come to Jesus than those who look like they have everything figured out. That's the irony, kind of the upside downness of the gospel, is that those who have been broken and are humble, they're the ones that reach out and recognize they need God. And those of us who often look like we have everything we need, especially us as Americans, we're so self-sufficient, we have everything we need. We we really don't truly believe that we're that desperate. We take God and we kind of sprinkle a little bit of God into our lives, but ultimately we try to use God as a genie. In many ways, we try to get him to do our will rather than us humbly submitting to his. And nothing communicates that more clearly than this last beatitude, because we are often very unwilling to be uncomfortable, much less suffer or be persecuted and have joy in the midst of it for the sake of God's kingdom. So here's the last simple point: is our willingness to be persecuted or suffer for others is our greatest indication of belonging to God's kingdom. It doesn't mean if you can't do that or haven't matured to that you don't. It just means that when you see that in someone who's willing to suffer and lose what they have, lose what they have gained in this world for the sake of the gospel, nothing more clearly screams the glory of God and the good of the gospel and the maturity of that person. Because to rejoice and be happy even when you lose everything that you have in this world can only happen when you are so convinced that the reward and the life that's waiting for you in eternity so exceeds anything you have in this world that it's foolish to hang on to it. I like to look at it like this: is pretend you have a McDonald's Happy Meal little Hot Wheel car that's yours, and you won it in your meal, or you got it in a meal or whatever, and you're playing with that little Hot Wheel, and someone says, hey, I want to promise you a real live Lamborghini, loaded, everything you want, multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's yours. But all you have to do is give up your little Hot Wheel. Now, I don't know any person in the world that wouldn't happily get rid of and lose that Hot Wheel, even if someone came around and ripped it out of their hands, if they knew that the moment they lost that, they gained the Lamborghini. It just would be foolish, because we know that what we're gaining is far superior to what we have. The only person who would get angry about losing the Hot Wheel is a person who really believes the value of the Hot Wheel is greater than the value of the Lamborghini. That's it. That's the only reason you'd be angry or upset in the midst of that. And the reality is, most of us get so upset about being persecuted or suffering or experiencing any kind of loss in this world because our heart, when we're really honest about it, values the things of this world much more than we value the things of God's kingdom. And that's a maturity issue in all of us, and one we need to grow in. So this last passage is really the most powerful and the height and the climax of the gospel of Jesus' message, because it reminds us that the gospel is all about losing this present life in order to gain the one that's so much greater and so much longer for all of eternity. And Jesus willingly and lovingly did that for you and I. And when we mature in that and we become like him, we will do the exact same thing for others. So that's the heart of his message. That's why this whole sermon is so powerful and impactful, is because it really teaches you this truth in a very practical way, in a very personal way, of what it means to be a follower of Jesus and to become more like him. So that's it for today. Glad you're with me. I know this wasn't the easiest lesson and not probably the most popular, but it's the truth. It's reality. And in fact, it should be more popular, because when you embrace it, you'll have the ability to have joy in circumstances you never, ever thought you could have joy in the past, because you'll start attaching your joy to your future circumstances and what awaits you in God's kingdom, and it won't be so tightly attached to the things of this world. Next week, we'll wrap this up, and you don't want to miss next week, because it's a conclusion. Jesus is going to bring this whole message to a conclusion, and the last handful of verses are a very powerful call to action, as well as identifying those who are going to follow and those who won't follow, and to find out whether we want to be on board with Jesus' kingdom. So come back next week. It'll be our last of these discipleship lessons online, and I will love to see you then. Y'all have a great week. and we will see you next week.